All right, welcome back. I hope you're having an amazing time so far. Our next session is titled AI the Right Way, Creation of a New Industry. This will be presented by two amazing speakers from Digital Diagnostics. Please join me in welcoming them to our virtual stage.
Well, hello. Thank you so much for being with us. We are excited to be with you today. We're going to talk about AI the right way and actually the creation of a new industry. So by way of quick introduction, speaking to you now, I'm Seth Rainford there at the bottom. I serve as our president and COO, Digital Diagnostics, and really focus on different market opportunities, different segments of the market, and also driving operational excellence within the company. I also want to briefly introduce Dr. Michael Abramoff. Dr. Abramoff is a neuroscientist, a practicing retina specialist, a computer engineer, and a Robert C. Watsky Endowed Professor of Ophthalmology, among many other things. He is the founder and serves as our executive chairman at Digital Diagnostics. And I will turn it to Michael here in just a moment. As we get started, I wanted to spend a moment and just set the table for what we're going to cover today. I will briefly introduce the company and talk about our path from science to patient care. I'll then turn it to Michael to spend a little bit of time on autonomous AI for diabetic retinopathy, macular edema, and dermatology. Michael will also talk about how to do autonomous AI the right way. And if you go to our website, you'll actually see that's our tagline and something near and dear to our hearts. Finally, I will wrap up with autonomous AI within the healthcare system, some more tactical things like billing, reimbursement, and quality measures. So to get started, you can see here a young Dr. Michael Abramoff. This is back in the 80s, talking about what we sometimes joke as a then skeptical audience on what is this thing around machine learning and neural networks. So in 1989, Michael publishes his first paper around machine learning using AI and neural networks. 11 years later, then specifically dives into diabetic retinopathy AI in 2000. And then 18 years after that, the first ever FDA approval for autonomous AI for diabetic retinopathy. And so the point here is this is not something that is brand new. It's really been evolving over many, many years, and is something that now is really ready for prime time in the market. Before I turn over to Michael, I want to set some definitions here as we think about AI today. So on the right, you see this column of assistive AI, and I would say 95%, maybe 98, 99% of the things that you hear in the media, in the news about new creations on AI being used in healthcare really falls into this category of assistive AI. And so what is that? It's when the AI is really enabling a clinician to make a decision. So of course you need that clinician, you need their time, you have an asynchronous gathering of information and then the result itself. You also sometimes need to bring in specialty care to help with that diagnosis. So in this situation, of course, the liability rests with the clinician. On the left, this is what we're really going to focus on today, and is really what our technology is about. It's this concept of autonomous AI, where you can see a juxtaposition between the two. The medical decision is made by the AI itself. There is no human oversight. That enables a decision to actually be made at the point of care in real time. Of course, then it is designed for primary care and those frontline care providers. And by its sheer nature, the liability then rests with the AI creator instead of that clinician. And so to tell us more about autonomous AI, I'll now turn it over to Dr. Abramoff. Michael?
Hey, Seth, thanks so much. It's very exciting to be addressing you. Next slide. And so autonomous AI is ideally positioned to address some of the problems we see in healthcare. That includes health disparities, where today many patients, including underserved communities, do not have access to high quality or any healthcare. And so it can address that because you can literally bring it anywhere there's an outlet. On the right, you see healthcare cost and productivity. Obviously, if you have the medical diagnosis made by an AI, you increase healthcare productivity. Also important are availability across the nation. On the bottom left, in purple, you see where ophthalmologists in this case are, so specialists. And in the center there in red and yellow, you see where most of the people with diabetes who need this eye care are. And you see there's a clear mismatch even geographically between the availability of that care and the need for it. And in bottom right, there's another problem, which is the workforce is aging, especially in healthcare. And so there's an ever larger gap between the demand for healthcare, high quality healthcare, and how many physicians and other providers are available to fill that gap. So it's addressing all of these, and we were working merrily along to solve these problems with autonomous AI. And then, of course, also last year, the pandemic came along, COVID-19, which, sort of made these problems even bigger and more urgent to address. And I'm happy to say that we are addressing that. All of these 5 different big problems in healthcare can be addressed with autonomous AI, as we will show. Next slide. And so here again is the problem with diabetes. Now in purple, the color where most, more purple is more people with diabetes. You can see that's mostly in the Southeast. That is not where their eye care is. And so you can see there's more than 30 million people with diabetes in the US, all of them at high risk of going blind from diabetic retinopathy. We know that the diabetic eye exam protects against going blind, is the solution, but only 15.3% of people who need it get an actual diabetic eye exam, meaning that more than 60,000 Americans go blind each year, most of which is not needed, meaning we know how to prevent this if we're just able to get these patients eye exams. Next slide. Similarly, for dermatologists, a big problem, melanoma, especially, and other skin cancers, but not enough care. So the demand is there, the need is there for people with suspect lesions on their arm or anywhere on their body to have a dermatologist look at them. But then you have a long wait, it's expensive, it's hard to access a dermatologist, and only 30 or 40% of actual skin concerns undergo review by a specialist, by a dermatologist. Similar problem as in diabetes. Next slide. And so we were faced with this problem. We have these algorithms to do autonomous AI. And on the left, you see, the system, including the update for the COVID area with the screen and the masks, etc. So it's really working well there. But how do we get these autonomous AI standardized tests in a safe, equitable way to patients on the right? And these are, friendly providers in a clinic, a very remote clinic in New Mexico, and they couldn't offer the diabetic eye exam to their patients. In comes the autonomous AI. Next slide. And so we solved that from a clinical perspective, but there's a whole other series of problems that you need to solve if you want to have a computer make a diagnosis in a safe and effective way. And this actually to work for all the stakeholders in the healthcare system. We're trying to show that here with this sequential steps. On the left, well, let's say that you have an algorithm that I think is really good and works in a laboratory setting. You actually need to build an ethical framework to make sure that people accept the safety, efficacy, and equity. You need to do clinical trial design, and we so designed the first ever clinical trial for an autonomous AI together with FDA, ultimately leading in 2018 to what Seth already mentioned, the first ever approval for an autonomous AI. Then it's needed that it's part of the standards of care. In this case, the standards of diabetes care that are created and updated every year by the American Diabetes Association. And I'm proud to say that last year they included autonomous AI. And then, of course, very important for any provider, any healthcare system, is how do you get paid for this? And thanks to the American Medical Association and very strong support from the American Academy of Ophthalmology, there was a new CPT code 929 created for autonomous AI, specifically for this diabetic eye exam, as well as Medicare in its final rule a few months ago now, coming out with a very strong support in the form of a $55 reimbursement for the CPT code 929. So all in a few years, essentially the entire healthcare system, supported the idea of this new industry of autonomous AI, medical decisions being made by autonomous AI, being reimbursed, being able to close care gaps for HEDIS and MIPS, being a regulatory approval, ultimately, of course, already leading to better outcomes for patients, which is ultimately what we are all doing this for, like I showed in the previous slide. So creating a new industry was interesting to say the least. And on the left, you see what we could have done, which is be the Uber of healthcare, breaking the system, going around it. And we decided not to do that. And on the right, therefore, you see the FDA and its press release about this first ever autonomous AI, we decided to work with all the stakeholders in healthcare to make sure that everyone feels that this is a win for them. Next slide. And that is, there's a risk that this goes wrong, that there will be a backlash for AI. And I don't have to dig very deep for examples in healthcare like gene therapy, which because of inappropriate trials where young people died, there was essentially a moratorium in terms of funding, research institutions closed, and only much later in 2017 did the FDA finally approve gene therapy, in this case for retinal disease. Theranos is another example that brings fear to the heart of many people in healthcare. It can go wrong so easily. Next slide. And so we had to create an ethical framework for AI, and from that derive requirements in the AI algorithm and how you implement it based on these ethics. And we're trying to show here that you need to find a balance between different aspects of ethics, including equity, autonomy for the patient, and patient benefit, also called non-maleficence. Next slide. And so we have published widely on this, including a special edition of the American Journal of Bioethics about a framework for AI and especially autonomous AI, and multiple publications followed. And it's, I think, that framework that has made all the stakeholders in healthcare so supportive of this way of a computer making a diagnosis. Next slide. And so these requirements follow, and I will briefly go over them because there's a lot to be said about this that we don't have the space for here. But essentially, ideally, you show that there's improvement in patient outcome shown by direct evidence. You design it so it mimics as much as possible human clinician cognition and what we know about that. You maximize what happens to the data so that the data cannot be abused. You validate it rigorously for safety in the actual workflow and in the actual usage as it will be used in clinic against ideally patient outcome. And also it needs to be clear who's liable for any problems or errors that the AI causes. Next slide. And so this AI patient centricity is shown by the relationship of the AI output to patient outcome. And in this case, we can say that AI, if it has a positive output, meaning the patient has the disease, their risk of having a very bad outcome in 3 years is 10 times increased compared to a negative output, as well as 7 times increased to have a poor outcome in 1 year. And that is essential. That shows how essential it is to ideally compare the AI output to patient outcome rather than what physicians say, because we would not have been able to relate the output of the AI to the patient outcome if left untreated otherwise. Next slide. Also important is solving for bias in AI. And here's an example from elsewhere where an AI that was trained on many white people's faces was unable to detect a face and recognize a face from a African-American person. And similarly, you have this problem in AI in healthcare. Next slide. Where some people have darker retinas, top left, than other people where it looks more reddish or orange. If you train your AI, and most of the AIs, including ours, are trained from example data, if you train it based on wrong distributions of data, for example, data that has dark retinas with fewer abnormalities, with fewer disease, the AI we presented with a new patient with a dark retina would inappropriately call it a normal rather than a diseased retina, therefore missing disease, potentially leading to blindness. If, however, you use racial invariant detectors for biomarkers like hemorrhages, exudates, these can be present in any colored retina in someone from any place in the world, and therefore you build in a robustness against racial bias directly into the AI. Next slide. And that leads to our approach to designing AI where there's multiple detectors for lesions rather than whole images, and so we don't have this risk of catastrophic failure and racial bias. Next slide. Another important aspect is don't do AI the wrong way. For example, validating it in the wrong workflow. And there's a famous example from mammography, from radiology, where there's an AI that performs really well against radiologists on its own, was approved by FDA. It had never been tested, however, in the actual workflow, which was that the radiologist with the AI together would sit around, look at a mammogram, and decide whether or not that patient was at risk of breast cancer and needing a biopsy. And it turned out if you tested the actual use of the AI as an assistive AI together with the radiologist in the workflow, it was actually being used rather than how it was validated by the FDA. In 200,000 women, the outcomes for women diagnosed by the AI with the radiologist were worse than the radiologist alone, showing that the AI can actually make it worse rather than better outcomes for patients. So you need to be really careful how you validate it and make sure that you mimic the clinical workflow as it will be used. And we paid great attention to that. Another aspect is how you compare it. What do you compare the AI to? How do you know that the AI is correct and not wrong, or otherwise that the AI is incorrect? One way is, and you see that often, is comparing it to clinicians, to experts. The problem in this case is that compared to outcome, clinicians like me, and include myself in these, have a sensitivity, meaning a correctness of only 33 or 34%, meaning most of this very specific level of disease is missed by physicians. And therefore, it's probably not a good idea to determine whether the AI is correct by comparing it to these physicians, because they're more wrong than not. Next slide. So we compare it to outcome. Another aspect is liability. We have published widely about this, and there's an earlier panel about the liability for AI creators. And it's good to see that the American Medical Association has also adopted this policy where autonomous AI creators have to be liable and have to be held liable and assume liability for the performance of the AI. Again, we created an industry, but it exists now, right? I mean, you can take an algorithm, an AI algorithm, and take all these steps to ethics, regulatory approval, inclusion in standards of care, reimbursement, coding, HIPS and MEDIS, care gap closure to benefit patients. This has been done for one, and we're expecting to do very soon for skin cancer. And so you will see many more. And it's just a very exciting time to be around now in this new industry. Next slide. Back to you, Seth.
Thanks, Dr. Abramoff. So I think that was a great foundation for how to do autonomous AI the right way. As I mentioned before, I want to spend a little bit more time talking about autonomous AI within the healthcare system. How do we practically enable this to really be used? And so, to start, we want to talk about how do we integrate into existing workflow. And so we've hit on a couple of these, so I'll just highlight. We want to be able to make a medical decision without human oversight. We also want to be able to say, look, there are not that many changes that are needed to your clinic or your lab workflow, to enable this to actually fit nicely into, for example, the vital sign lane in a practice. We also wanted to be able to use existing staff, so you don't have to go out and hire a bunch of other people to come in and operate. In the same vein, we also don't want it to be highly intensive in terms of training or enable the existing people there to have to be trained specifically around the technology that we're putting in, instead of getting some new certification to be able to operate the tech. Finally, we want to be able to automate claims, billing, and care gap closure. So we want real-time generation of these claims and this program integrity aspect that we're introducing into these practices. So how does it actually work? Starting on the left, and you see IDXDR, the technology really we've been focused on so far today. We're capturing 2 images of each eye using a robotic fundus camera. Moving towards the middle, we're then getting a negative or positive result. And of course, this is FDA cleared, as we mentioned. Finally, on the right, you have results in triage. You actually have a report that's being sent into and integrated nicely into the electronic health record. So that's how the product works. But as Michael talked about a little bit, how does this become more meaningful to the customers that are using it? Well, on the left, you see, and Michael had mentioned a little bit, 11.17 in the ADA standard of care, fitting into the existing standard of care. On the right, you see NCQA's specific language around their technical specifications that were updated. So they're therefore helping providers, helping plans to actually close that care gap and meet some of those incentives that they're after. The final piece there is also payment, coverage and payment for CMS And you can see that earlier this year, 92229 was introduced as the first ever CPT code for this innovative artificial intelligence. And you see in the language that it performs the interpretation of an eye exam without requiring an ophthalmologist to actually interpret the results. Dr. Abramoff also mentioned the level of reimbursement. So this is something that CMS has been tremendously supportive of, getting this to frontline care providers and enabling them to actually have something that's covered and paid for. So I'm going to close with just a couple of case studies that we think are relevant. The first of which is primary care in New Orleans. You can see starting on the left, pre-implementation, we had a largely Black population and hardly any care providers that resulted in more than 800 patients that had care gaps for the diabetic eye exam. And you also had this 4-month appointment wait time to get in to see a provider. We then implemented IDXDR. We had tremendous success in terms of image sufficient quality. And after just 9 months after going live, we had eliminated all of those 800 care gaps and were able to enable same-day appointments for an eye exam if in fact it was needed. And then going back to my earlier point of some of the provider feedback, we had some nice quotes that came out of this where the providers really felt confident about the referrals they were making because of our technology, and also talking about some of the efficiency that our technology enabled there as well. Also important to point out on the right, a quarter of these patients had a potentially blinding disease. So also helpful to tie back to the mission of really saving sight for these patients. The next case study is in Iowa. This really is speaking more to the COVID era. We had 100 patients that were not tested in this environment. 70 of them got tested within a month there in May. The other 30 also were tested as of June. So just in a few months here, you had your entire backlog that was completely cleared out. Also important to mention that 17% of these patients had a potentially blinding disease. And I also want to mention that we were obviating that extra need for the patient to see one more provider at a time when we were really trying to limit human interaction as best as we could. Final case study is actually in the retail setting. So thinking about bringing specialty care to a retail setting. This is a partnership that we have in some Safeways and in the primary care clinics there. You can see on the right, Eric Topol talking about how do you know when AI for health is being implemented, when you can go into a grocery store and have your eyes checked for diabetic retinopathy. So we're really trying to figure out a way how to meet patients where they want to experience healthcare. And that includes primarily the primary care provider setting, but also moving into retail health. So I just want to wrap up and say, and this is something that our company has been saying for years and years, the future really is now. We have these products that are out in the market today, and it's one platform we're trying to create to empower primary care, expedite those referral pathways, and also to close care gaps in care. You see there on the left the IDXDR. The doctor there is also holding our next product, DermSpot, which Michael had referred to a little bit. And so as we continue to add on to this platform, we really want to, we really hope that our technology can do a lot of good in years to come. So with that, we will close and thank you. And we will certainly take questions in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. Thank you both for sharing with us. This has been an incredible presentation, and we really appreciate these insights. So I know the audience is giving you a huge virtual round of applause. All right, for the audience, it's time for you to make your way to your next session. Along the way, make sure you accept those connection requests and check out our awesome AI exhibits. Thanks so much, and we'll see you around.